here. I built this engine, and you guys have seen it on some of my older videos. If not, go ahead and check out some of my older videos with this thing. But basically, I built that engine, and I should say assembled, not built. I assembled that engine in about 5 days with all of my used junk parts. And I wasn't going to be doing anything with them anymore, so I said hell with it. Let's slap something together. So I put together a 1641, and that block was my very first engine. It had the 1641 pistons, which are still on this, and it had the VZ25 cam. It had those Webers that were over there. It had these intake manifolds and that other ignition. And with that thing revving out so hard, it ended up rattling that whole damn thing loose. So I had head studs that came out, the threads got screwed up in the block, even the K-savers got screwed up. There was other studs that just were pulling out left and right, the generator studs, the alternator, or excuse me, the fuel pump studs, you name it, they were just pulling out. So a bunch of that stuff, being a garbage build, was JB welded back in. It's like, you know, you don't give a shit about it if it's just a slap together, let's experiment motor. Well, it ended up having, let's see, a stock crank that basically was scored up, and I just kind of cleaned it up with some emery cloth. The gland nut was kind of, the threads in that were kind of screwed up. Mismatched rods, stock cam that, who knows. Well, I mean, it looked okay, but I didn't measure anything on it. Originally had a set of single port heads, and that was it. And I ran it naturally aspirated for about 1,000 miles. And the engine, finally, when I was adjusting the valves, I noticed it kept getting tight. Well, it was beating the, and actually, I wonder if I have those over here. I don't know. It kept beating the seat. Might be it. Kept beating the seat into the head. So my valves were getting so tight that when the when I'd go to adjust it, the rocker arm was up against the retainer. Let's spin this side. You can kind of see that recess there. It was really beating that sucker into the head, and you can kind of see that side was okay. But yeah, so then I was in search for a set of heads, so I bought a set of AA's, $200 brand new pair. I think maybe it was $250, I don't know. They were cheap, brand new set of China heads. And I basically lapped the valves. I put single high rev springs on it, and I didn't gap the rings for boost or nothing. I literally slapped the engine together again. And let me see if I can find a light. I know I've got a light. Anyways, I put the motor together again with all homemade intake manifold. Got some metal from a buddy of mine to make the aluminum adapters, but it's just sitting underneath my bench right now. It has a stock center section for the intake, and you can see the flange right there. And then I took another stock intake, flipped it upside down, and brought it up and made another flange on the bottom side to that piece of aluminum. And that's an AMR 500 Supercharger. And I was going over a certain look I had in my head. I wanted that Supercharger right in the center of the car, and I wanted it sticking up out of the hood like a hot rod, so that's what I did. There's a little doubler bracket I made. The crank pulley is off of a, damn mosquito. The crank pulley is off of a Chevy 2.8 V6. I just centered it up, drilled and tapped the crank, all done by hand. It's pretty damn straight. Made my own linkage there out of ball ends for dual carbs, brake line going up, and that is a old Rochester single barrel off of my dad's inline 6 250 Chev. And that only has one jet. I had to drill it up one size, and this carburetor, I ain't shitting you, this was the closest to fuel injection I've ever seen. It was almost perfect, wide open throttle and cruise. It started making a little bit of noise, so I pulled it before it did any damage. But this thing will get revamped here someday, and then this engine will end up going into the Volksrod here in the next few years. So, as I usually do, I kind of got mixed up with, or just kind of jumping around with my storytelling, but basically the next few years, what I have planned with this car is I will get this motor dialed in with that ignition system and those carbs, and then this motor I'm going to pull out. I'm going to put that in my wife's Bug, Jolly Bug, as you have seen in some of my videos, and this thing's going to rip in my wife's car. So then I will be taking that supercharged motor, and I'll be doing a video of that where basically I'm going to tear it apart, go through it, see if anything's bad or whatever, but it's basically going to get changed around. So I'll still use the same case, but if it needs to be line bored, I'll line bore it here. And then I have that tool for opening up the cylinder spigots in the case, and for opening up the CCs, or excuse me, for opening up the heads for the larger pistons. So what I have for that is I'm going to put my VZ25 cam back in that block, and I have a cast stroker crank from, it had to have been probably the 70s or 80s, before my time, but it was pretty nice shape. It came in my 2058 when I first got that as a used core, and the guy who did my machine work on that block, he said, it's a nice crank, but I wouldn't run it. And I said, why is that? And he goes, well, that's a cast crank, and they're known to explode at any point in time. So I was like, yikes. So I ended up putting an 80 mil stroker crank in my stroker. But anyways, the supercharged motor, we'll get that cast 78 mil crank. And again, this is an experimental motor to me. It's built out of used garbage parts, you know, whatever. It's about fun. You know, let's see what we can build with what we got. And that's what I did here. And at 4 to 5 pounds boost, or maybe even 3 to 5, this thing kicked ass. It was so slow. It was like a 1200 cc. It had massive deck height that was 7.4 to 1 compression ratio, if I remember right, in naturally aspirated form. And it would propel the Bug, but I mean, it had low oil pressure. It was just, I mean, it was used pistons, used rings. I didn't do anything besides, you know, like clean them off with brake clean and put everything together. So it was a huge experiment, and I'll tell you, it was more fun to experiment and make the intake manifold and tune it. I mean, it was kind of a pain to tune at first, but to do all this stuff was more joyful to me than building my stroker engine. Although when I built my stroker engine, it was my first engine that I would consider that I built versus assembled. I did a lot of measuring, a lot of clearancing by hand, a lot of research, learning how to use the tools, the dial bore gauge, and getting more familiar with calipers, and just measuring everything a bunch of times, buying 5 sets of bearings to get my radial oil clearance just where I wanted it. So it took me over a year and like $4,000 to build that 2058, and that was with, you know, cheaper parts through AA Performance. But yeah, that slapped together engine that's sitting underneath my bench, that was a fun engine to build, a fun engine to drive. The torque was awesome. I mean, it just had instant torque. It was basically like you're driving a stroker. I'd say the torque was equivalent with my stroker, and the stroker has a what is that cam? It's a webcam, a 86B or 86A. I'll have to look, but anyways, the stroker is a good runner. Don't get me wrong. But anyways, yeah. So this is again gonna get rebuilt with parts that I have. It'll be done better this time. If any more studs are coming loose, guess what? They'll get the JB Weld treatment as a good old fun case. You know, who cares? If it blows up, it blows up. Hence why I'm using the cast stroker crank in this. It's like a ticking time bomb or a hand grenade. If it lasts, cool. If not, no sweat. I'm having fun. So it'll have the 78 stroke crank. I have a set of 90.5 A pistons, which are not for a stroker crank, so it's going to make this motor pretty wide, but being in the back of the Volksrod, that'll be perfect. And then again, the VZ25 cam will go in that motor, and that supercharger right there is going to be getting changed, which means I'm probably going to be changing all my brackets, and I'll show you what I'll be putting on that motor. That is an SC12 supercharger. That's off of Toyota Privia minivans or Toyota MR2s. On top of it is a Predator carburetor. I might run that. I might run one of my fuel injection systems. I don't know. That's just, it's sitting on there right now. It's not bolted down by any means, but this supercharger, I got this off of eBay for a pretty good deal. They're kind of hard to find. They would originally have a clutch like on an AC compressor on your car, so you could kind of turn your supercharger on and off like Mad Max if you really wanted to. But once you got the power, you don't want to be without the power. So somebody, this is going to go on a Harley, I believe the guy said. They made their own adapter to put this Gilmer style pulley on, so I'll have to get a Gilmer pulley for the crank. I'll have to buy that, and then the belt and tensioner, of course. I'll probably figure out what I can do there. But these superchargers put out 1200 cc's a revolution, where that AMR 500 only puts out 500 cc's a revolution. So this thing is going to be awesome, man. I'm excited. I don't know when I'm going to build it. The motor's going to be done in a couple years, I'm sure. But it'll be having its own video series for sure. It's going to be fun. Another option that I have on some motor build at some point in time is I have this old intake manifold here, and I'm wanting to say it was for a Holley bug spray. And then I found this old 2-barrel to 4-barrel adapter that bolted right on. Right now I have just a Phytech sitting on top of it. But one thing I could build with that is I have a few of these, and I think that these are really cool. It's a piece of old speed equipment. This is a carburetor adapter, basically, or a blow-through, or excuse me, a draw-through turbo setup, bolt-on. So this was made by Excel and Rotomaster, and they made kits for Chevy, Ford, Dodge, you know, basically anything that had a 4-barrel intake. And this would bolt on in place of your stock carburetor. You'd have a carburetor sitting on top, and when you were not in boost, the air and the fuel would not only mix through the turbo, which was mounted on the passenger side, on a Chevy at least, come back around and then go right into your intake manifold, but it would also go through these discs, which basically just go on that little shaft. So when you go into boost, full boost I should say, those discs shut, and then all the air and the fuel go through the turbo and into the motor. Now this is how primitive this setup is. Instead of having a wastegate to control your boost, this is called a priority valve. So when you would start getting into too much boost, it would just choke off the turbo. That's some primitive shit. And then after that, let's see. Got a mess on the bench I need to clean up. After that, to regulate boost, they had this, and this would go in line, and again it would restrict the boost, which as everybody knows, well, maybe not everybody, but as a lot of people know, all that's going to do is probably hurt your turbo in the long run and increase charge temp. So that rod, you know, that'll be gone, this will be gone, a port done, and it will be, when it's used, regulated off a wastegate. So with that intake and the adapter, I would probably have to run a generator with this intake. I'm not sure, but then imagine that sucker on it with a turbo sitting out the back of the car on a bug. That would just be insane. There's one of the crossover pipes that would go from the turbo back to the intake. So yeah, I mean, that could be built someday on something too. The Volksrod would be perfect for it. It's wide open in the back. Don't have to worry about deck lids or any of that. But yeah, that's the plan so far. So Volksrod's going to be getting some updates. I'm going to be going through the back brakes on the car just because I haven't pulled the drums off since I've owned it. So that will be getting addressed. Motor's going to be dialed in, check all the CV bolts, the IRS bolts, just, you know, make sure it's safe. I already put some new brake fluid in the reservoir, so it's got fresh fluid, even though it's only a couple years old. And other than that, just drive it. My bug's going to be down, my Herbie, that's going to be down this year, I think, just having the newborn, and this I'm just kind of taking my leisure at, you know, so. Mine, I want to tear that stroker apart. I got like 3,500 miles on it, I think. Of just pretty much straight abuse, wide open throttle, bringing her, you know, revving it out, you know, driving it like I built it. So I want to tear that motor apart while it's out of my bug, reseal it, check the bearings, you know, and if it needs anything addressed, then it'll get fixed at that time. But this summer's going to be the summer of the chop top, and then I'll be bringing a Jolly Bug out, you know, getting its legs out and stretched when my wife doesn't want to drive it. You know, she'd rather have the AC. I don't blame her. It's starting to get warm for all of us Washingtonians that can't handle the heat. But yeah, it's going to be fun. So I think the dual Webers and that ignition is really going to make this 914 come alive. Oh yeah. And back to what happened with my 1641 originally. So when I first had it, I had the other set of Webers, not this set, but we'll just use this as an example. And I had it, you know, running pretty well. I was taken off from my parents' house when I lived with them when I was younger. And all of a sudden, it just started going bang, 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 bang. I'm like, oh my goodness, you know, so I shut it off. And what happened was, one of these, it had the stud come out like this one with that jam nut. Well, that jam nut came loose because the stud broke. The jam nut went down the carburetor until it got sucked in. So I ended up, I didn't bend a valve or anything, but I put a new set of pistons in, which the new set of pistons are on that. And it ran all right, but something else happened during that time. And I think when I was tearing it apart when I was younger, I pulled the distributor out, and the distributor drive came out, and the shims fell out and got eaten up by the oil pump. And so yeah, that original rotating assembly is garbage and stuff. But yeah, these carburetors ran out, or the other carburetors ran out really well on that carburetor, or on that engine back in the day, and it ran out good on my stroker. And this is the Gene-Berg linkage that I've had, and I ended up getting these off of eBay. They're just carb down rods, I think they call them. So I know the Gene-Berg linkage, they come down, they're kind of an S to go to the carburetor, so I'm either going to be bending these or cutting them and using some 1/4 inch brake line and bending it and then welding these into that brake line. That way you can adjust it. And I also got tired with that center pole linkage. You know, you'd have to adjust the linkage when it was hot. Well, then when it was cold, it would be opening up one of these carburetors slightly. Just because of the design, you know, the horizontally opposed engine, when it heats up, it expands, it becomes wider. So this style or a hex bar is really the ticket to keeping your carbs dialed in. And this is an old unit, but I've had this since my very first car, and it will be used again. And for comparison, on these intake manifolds, here you can see how the flange has been flipped. Yeah, those are about the same height. Yep, those are quite a bit shorter though. Very interesting. But yeah, those things won't be run. They're good intake. You know, CB makes some nice stuff. But I think we'll be running these. Anyhow, everybody, thanks for hanging out on this another long video, just shooting the shit in the garage and going over a few things. But anyhow, thanks for subbing. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you guys.